11:47 p.m. Djibouti. Camp Lemonnier sits on the southern edge of Djibouti International Airport, separated from the Chinese People's Liberation Army Support Base by approximately 3.4 kilometers of urban terrain and a single shared perimeter fence at the airport's western boundary. The U.S. facility hosts approximately 4,000 military and civilian personnel, a joint air component, and the Combined Joint Task Force, Horn of Africa. The Chinese facility, which opened in 2017 as China's first overseas military base, formally hosts support and logistics functions for PLA Navy vessels operating in the Gulf of Aden. The two facilities have shared the same geographic node on the Horn of Africa for 8 years. In those 8 years, the Chinese facility had grown. The original construction footprint of the PLA Support Base had been publicly documented at approximately 36 hectares in 2017. Satellite imagery analysis conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and by commercial imagery providers had tracked a progressive expansion that had reached approximately 94 hectares by the time of the events of this particular night. An expansion that included a pier structure capable of hosting Type 052D destroyers, hardened aircraft shelters consistent with combat aircraft operations, and a signals collection facility whose antenna arrays had been assessed by the intelligence community as capable of monitoring Camp Lemonier's radio frequency emissions across a substantial portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. The intelligence community assessment had described the antenna array as monitoring. The capability it represented had a second operational application that the assessment's carefully chosen language had not fully characterized. It could also transmit at power levels that the signal's intelligence had not yet confirmed, but that the antenna's physical construction indicated could reach into the interference range for Camp Lemonier's communications and radar systems. At 11:47 p.m., that assessment became operational fact. The GPS receivers at Camp Lemonnier began registering positioning errors at 11:47 p.m. Not a complete GPS outage, a subtle drift initially within the tolerance band of normal GPS variation that began moving steadily outside the normal range over the following 4 minutes. By 11:51 p.m., GPS accuracy at Camp Lemonnier and the adjacent airfield had degraded to approximately 47 meters circular error probable. 47 meters was not operationally catastrophic for base navigation. It was operationally significant for precision approach guidance at Djibouti's runway 09, the runway approach that Camp Lemonier's aircraft used for operations. An aircraft configured for a precision approach using GPS-augmented navigation in conditions of reduced visibility was using a system that was providing positioning data with 47 meters of uncertainty. In fog or heavy rain at a runway with limited instrument landing system backup, that uncertainty was operationally relevant. The GPS drift was the subtlest of the three components. The positioning error had not appeared instantaneously. It had accumulated over 4 minutes in a pattern consistent with a low-power narrowband interference signal rather than a broadband denial operation. The narrowband approach was technically more sophisticated than the IRGC's GPS denial operations that the U.S. military had encountered repeatedly in the Middle East. A broadband denial produces an immediate, obvious outage that every GPS-dependent system simultaneously registers. A narrowband approach that gradually shifts positioning accuracy from 3 meters to 47 meters over 4 minutes does not trigger immediate automated alerts. It falls within the range of GPS variability that operators have learned to accept as normal atmospheric variation. The choice of narrowband over broadband was the first indication to the Camp Lemonnier intelligence officer that the operation had been designed to evade rapid detection. The antenna array's operator had calibrated the interference for maximum effect with minimum early warning signature. At 11:52 p.m., the base communications officer registered a second anomaly. The Camp Lemonnier Operations Center's primary tactical communications net was experiencing increased bit error rates. Packet loss occurring at approximately 3.1%, up from the baseline of 0.4%. The communications center's automated diagnostic system attributed the error rates to atmospheric propagation effects and logged the event as a technical anomaly. The communications officer was not satisfied with the atmospheric attribution. The night was clear. The atmospheric profile showed no propagation anomaly that the system's historical models associated with 3.1% packet loss. She logged a manual flag at 11:52:44 p.m. At 11:53:19 p.m., the airfield's primary approach radar registered what its maintenance diagnostic described as a harmonic interference return, a spurious signal at a frequency close to the radar's operating band that was producing ghost returns in the 2 to 8 kilometer approach sector. Ghost returns in the approach sector were a navigational safety event. The airfield duty controller immediately placed the airfield on precautionary hold. No approach or departure clearances until the radar anomaly was resolved. 3 separate systems, 4 minutes apart, each individually explicable as a technical anomaly in systems that were genuinely complex and genuinely prone to technical anomalies. Collectively, they formed a pattern that the Camp Lemonnier intelligence officer notified about the third anomaly at 11:54 p.m. as she was still reviewing the flag on the second, recognized as an electronic interference signature consistent with a coordinated broadband jamming operation. She had been at Camp Lemonnier for 9 months and had received specific training on the electronic signature of the PLA Support Base's antenna array capabilities. She transmitted a preliminary assessment at 11:54:41 p.m. Probable directed electronic interference from an adjacent source, GPS denial, communications degradation, and radar interference occurring simultaneously. The assessment reached CENTCOM at 11:55:08 p.m. and the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs Watch Desk at 11:55:14 p.m. Both transmitted immediate queries to the Djibouti government's Ministry of National Defense through the established liaison channel. The Djibouti government was the landlord for both facilities. China had negotiated its base access agreement directly with Djibouti's government. The US had the older agreement. Both paid rent. Both had formal obligations to Djibouti's sovereignty framework. And Djibouti, a country of approximately 1 million people landlocked between Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia, with no meaningful independent military capacity, hosting military facilities for the United States, France, Japan, Italy, Germany, and China simultaneously, was the only actor in the situation with the sovereign authority to address what was happening at the Chinese facility from a host nation perspective. At 11:57 p.m., the Camp Lemonnier commanding general contacted the CJTF-HOA commander through a secured line and provided the intelligence officer's assessment. The commander authorized 2 immediate actions. First, activate the base's backup electronic capabilities, specifically the AN/MLQ-40 Prophet and the electronic warfare suite that had been added to the Camp Lemonnier footprint following a force protection upgrade in 2023. Which included direction-finding capability that could precisely geolocate the source of the interference signals. Second, contact the French military facility at Camp Lemonnier's northern boundary. The French 5th Overseas Interarms Regiment maintained a separate but adjacent presence, and request that the French communications officer share his network status. If the French systems were unaffected, the interference was targeted at US systems specifically. If the French systems were also affected, the source was broad spectrum and the attribution was less specific. The Prophet system's direction-finding analysis was completed at 12:02 a.m., 9 minutes after the intelligence officer's initial assessment. The interference source was geolocated to an azimuth of 287 degrees from Camp Lemonnier's communications center, at a range consistent with the PLA Support Base's antenna array position. The uncertainty ellipse in the geolocation covered the southern third of the Chinese facility's footprint. The French liaison call, completed at 12:01 a.m., had produced the other key data point. The French forces' communications and GPS were functioning normally. The interference was targeted. Camp Lemonniere's systems were specifically affected. The French facility 600 meters to the north was not. The situation that Camp Lemonnier found itself in at 12:04 a.m. was the operational expression of a strategic problem that the DoD's base access community had been analyzing for 6 years. What does the United States do when a rival military facility, co-located with a U.S. facility on the same sovereign territory, uses its physical proximity to conduct electronic operations that fall below the kinetic threshold, but above the threshold of normal competition? The problem had been theoretical. It was no longer theoretical. The U.S. facility's treaty with Djibouti had been negotiated in 2014 under conditions that had not included a Chinese military facility 3.4 kilometers away. The treaty did not address the rights and obligations of the parties in the event that a third party operating on the same sovereign territory conducted interference operations against U.S. systems. The Chinese facility's access agreement with Djibouti also did not address this scenario, not because the drafters had overlooked it, but because neither party had wanted to constrain the antenna array's operational flexibility in writing. The attribution was not ambiguous. The legal framework for responding to it was: Camp Lemonnier was a U.S. military installation operating under a bilateral agreement with the Djiboutian government. The PLA Support Base was a Chinese military installation operating under a separate bilateral agreement with the same Djiboutian government. The electronic interference being transmitted from the Chinese facility was originating from the sovereign territory of Djibouti, targeting a U.S. military facility on the sovereign territory of Djibouti, in a context where both facilities had legal status under Djiboutian law. The U.S. could not conduct a kinetic response against the PLA Support Base's antenna array without conducting a military operation against a Chinese military facility on Djiboutian soil, an action that would require Djiboutian sovereign authorization and would carry escalation implications that the immediate situation did not yet warrant. The U.S. could transmit jamming signals that would interfere with the PLA Support Base's operations. But this would be an electronic operation conducted against a Chinese military facility from U.S. military assets on Djiboutian soil, with the same sovereignty and escalation complications. The U.S. could request that the Djiboutian government order the Chinese facility to cease its operations. A diplomatic approach that was the legally correct response, but that would require hours, not minutes, to produce any effect. The Camp Lemonnier intelligence officer had been building a classified file on the PLA Support Base's antenna array for 7 months before this night. Her file contained 23 separate technical assessments of the array's apparent operational parameters derived from signals intelligence monitoring conducted through Camp Lemonnier's own collection assets. The file had been transmitted to Indopacom, CENTCOM, and DIA in 3 separate products. None of the 3 products had generated a policy response. The intelligence had been received, assessed, and filed. The file had not become policy because the policy question it raised, whether to formally protest the array's existence before it was used offensively or to wait for an operational triggering event, had been deferred. The deferral had been a policy choice. The intelligence officer whose file had informed that choice was now watching the policy's consequences play out in the precautionary hold on her airfield's runway and the fuel state of 2 MQ-9s in the pattern. At 12:04 a.m., CENTCOM transmitted a formal protest to the PRC embassy in Washington and to the Chinese facility's identified communications channel through the military-to-military hotline that had been established for Horn of Africa safety communications 2 years earlier. The protest stated that Camp Lemonier's systems were experiencing directed electronic interference consistent with transmission from the PLA Support Base's antenna array. That such interference constituted a hostile act under the laws governing electronic warfare between military installations, and that the United States demanded immediate cessation of the interference. The Chinese facility did not respond to the military-to-military channel. The PRC embassy in Washington acknowledged receipt of the protest at 12:19 a.m. and stated that it was seeking clarification from relevant Chinese authorities. The interference continued. At 12:07 a.m., CENTCOM authorized the Camp Lemonnier commander to activate the base's electronic countermeasures in a strictly defensive configuration, specifically the GPS anti-jam capability that would restore positioning accuracy for Camp Lemonier's internal systems without transmitting any signal outside the base perimeter. The anti-jam system, once activated, restored GPS accuracy to within 3 meters for receivers inside the base's perimeter. Systems outside the perimeter, including the airfield's approach guidance infrastructure, which was technically civilian infrastructure shared with the commercial airport, remained affected. The airfield remained on precautionary hold. 3 aircraft that had been in the local pattern when the hold was placed had diverted to the alternate field at Arta, 28 kilometers west of Djibouti City. All 3 landed safely. The hold's continuation was creating an operational constraint that would become significant if the situation extended beyond approximately 4 hours, at which point the fuel state of 2 MQ-9 Reapers in the extended patrol queue would require them to land regardless of airfield conditions. At 12:14 a.m., the Djiboutian Ministry of National Defense transmitted a formal message to both the USCJ-TFHOA command element and the PLA Support Base's command element. The message stated that the Djiboutian government had received the U.S. protest, that Djibouti took seriously any allegation of unauthorized electronic interference, that it was initiating a joint investigation under the terms of its facility access agreements with both parties, and that it was requesting both parties refrain from any escalatory actions pending the investigation's preliminary findings. The investigation would be conducted by the Djiboutian National Gendarmerie's Technical Department. Its preliminary findings would be available within 48 hours. 48 hours. The Djiboutian government's response was legally appropriate, procedurally consistent with its treaty obligations, and operationally useless for the next 4 minutes, which was when the first MQ-9's fuel state would reach its mandatory recovery threshold. At 12:17 a.m., with the PLA Support Base's antenna array still transmitting and the Djiboutian investigation process underway, the Camp Lemonnier commander made a decision that was not in the playbook, because the playbook had not anticipated this specific combination of factors. He authorized the base's electronic warfare team to activate a directional jamming system on a narrow frequency band corresponding to the GPS denial component of the interference signature, aimed at the interference source's geolocated position. The jamming was not kinetic. It transmitted no signal into Chinese-claimed territory. It was transmitted from U.S.-occupied territory toward an interference source also on Djiboutian territory. Its effect was to contest the specific frequency being used for the GPS denial component, effectively jamming the jammer, using directed transmission that would reach the PLA Support Base's antenna array. The commander knew this action was outside his pre-authorized parameters. He also knew the MQ-9s had 11 minutes of fuel margin remaining. The GPS denial interference at Camp Lemonier's airfield area ceased at 12:19 a.m., 2 minutes after the directional jamming activation. The airfield's GPS accuracy restored to 4.1 meters. The airfield duty controller lifted the precautionary hold at 12:21 a.m. Both MQ-9s recovered safely, the first at 12:24 a.m. with 8 minutes of fuel remaining, the second at 12:27 a.m. with 14 minutes remaining. The communications degradation and radar interference continued until 12:44 a.m., at which point both anomalies resolved simultaneously, suggesting that the PLA Support Base had made a deliberate decision to reduce its interference signature following the GPS jamming counter. The cessation at 12:44 a.m. was logged as voluntary withdrawal of the operation, not as a response to the U.S. counter-jamming specifically, because the communications and radar components had continued for 25 minutes after the GPS jamming had been countered. The full picture would be assembled in a classified after-action review over the following week. Time from first GPS anomaly to intelligence officer assessment, 7 minutes 38 seconds. Time from assessment to profit geolocation, 9 minutes. Confirmed interference source, PLA Support Base antenna array, azimuth 287 degrees. French facility systems unaffected, confirmed targeted interference. US-based GPS accuracy at peak degradation, 47 meters CEP. Airfield precautionary hold duration 32 minutes. Aircraft diverted 3, all safe. MQ-9 fuel margin at airfield restoration, 8 and 14 minutes respectively. US directional counter-jamming authorized, outside pre-approved parameters, commander's discretion. GPS interference cessation, 2 minutes after counter-jamming activation. Full interference cessation, 12:44 a.m., 57 minutes after first anomaly. Djiboutian investigation, initiated 48-hour preliminary timeline. U.S. formal protest, acknowledged by PRC embassy, no substantive response within operational period. PLA Support Base formal response none. The 29-day approval timeline for the pre-authorized parameters update, measured from the commanding general's submission to the Joint Chiefs' approval, was itself a data point about the institutional response velocity for policy questions in the electronic warfare domain. 29 days was fast by the standards of DoD policy review, which typically measured in months. It was also a precise measure of the gap between the operational reality that the 12:17 a.m. authorization had addressed and the institutional architecture that governed it. The commander had been right. The parameters had been wrong. The approval had come 29 days later. In the 29 days between the incident and the approval, the parameters had remained unchanged. If the operation had recurred in that 29-day window, the same commander would have faced the same gap between authorized response and operationally required response. He had been informed of this possibility in the approval notification and had been told to use his judgment accordingly. The after-action review's classification was its first operating parameter. Its second was the question it could not answer with the available evidence: whether the operation had been a test, a calibration of what the antenna array could produce and what Camp Lemonnier could detect, or an operational deployment in the context of a broader strategic movement that the Camp Lemonnier intelligence cell had not yet identified. The 57-minute duration was consistent with both interpretations. The cessation was consistent with both interpretations. The targeting of U.S. systems while leaving French systems unaffected was consistent with a deliberate test of a specific capability against a specific adversary. It was also consistent with a broader operation that had achieved its objective in 57 minutes. The commanding general's after-action submission to CENTCOM contained a single recommendation beyond the standard operational reporting. The pre-approved parameters for electronic countermeasures response to directed interference should be updated to include commander's discretion authority when the interference creates an aviation safety event involving aircraft in active fuel-critical recovery situations. The recommendation was reviewed at CENTCOM, forwarded to the Joint Chiefs, and approved within 29 days. The PLA Support Base's antenna array continued to operate normally in the weeks that followed.